Chris Cillizza, CNN political analyst David Drucker, and author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, Gordon Chang. Gordon, the president choosing to tweet about this situation going on, whether we have the tweet or not. Basically, this time, the president saying, well, China, North Korea, trade grew by almost 40% in the first quarter. So much for China working with us, but we had to give it a try. We had Republican Congressman Lee Zeldin on the show. I asked him, is it as simple as this? He said, no. There's a problem doing diplomacy by tweet, but this is a little bit of a hole the president just put himself in, isn't it?
Well, this particular tweet, not so bad, but the one just after the missile launch was terrible because it was a lighthearted tweet saying, oh, Kim Jong-un doesn't have anything better to do. We got to remember that on the 1st of this year, Kim Jong-un said he's going to test an ICBM. On January 2nd, Trump said it isn't going to happen. So it was really wrong for Trump on Sunday to say, this doesn't really matter, because it does. And it also undercut some very good diplomacy Trump engaged in last week. He just undercut it with tweets. So clearly...
Wait a minute, I don't understand. You mean that people are Kim Jong-un is taking President Trump's tweets seriously and responding to them? I mean, how is it undercutting the diplomacy?
I don't think that it really matters what Kim Jong-un thinks, but it does matter what the Chinese think. And last week, Trump put sanctions on a Chinese bank.
Right.
He sold arms to Taiwan. He did a number of things to impose costs on China, which was the right thing to do. And then, just after the missile launch, we have these lighthearted tweets saying, oh, maybe China will help us. That was really the wrong tone for the President of the United States. It confuses China, and clearly it shows the President being less than resolute, which is what he needs to be going into this meeting, not only with Xi Jinping of China, but also Vladimir Putin, who also has a lot of equity in the North Korean matters. So what Trump did was undermine himself with just a few 140-character messages.
And also, look, it's about using a blunt force object on a delicate situation. Even the Chinese sanctions, Mnuchin was very careful to say this is about the bank, not the country. We're going after the bank for what it did. We're not going after China. So they're trying to be subtle. These tweets are the opposite. David Drucker, in terms of what the party, what is a support base is expecting out of this trip, especially the face-to-face with China and Russia, what do you see as the mandate?
Well, look, I think that for Trump, there's still so much unknown about what he really wants to do with American foreign policy, because you look at what members of his national security team do, and we have a very sort of conventional American and Republican foreign policy, putting sanctions on the Chinese bank, beefing up security in NATO, and yet you have the president and his rhetoric suggesting otherwise. And so I think the interesting thing about this trip will be to see, number one, if he finally personally starts to treat the Russians as an adversary the way the rest of his administration has, or whether he continues to coddle Vladimir Putin, and does he send a personal message of reassurance to NATO, or does he continue to keep them guessing and leave that sort of thing to other members of his administration? I think it would help him and help his leadership, especially looking at what has happened in North Korea, if he would start to embrace some of what we have seen from General McMaster, his national security advisor, General Mattis, his defense secretary, in terms of backing up the idea that the U.S. is going to be engaged and not going to allow these things to proliferate. But, as with Trump, hope may spring eternal. I just don't necessarily see him changing his tune personally, and I think that'll continue to create a dichotomy in terms of what the administration does behind the scenes and how the president is leading out in front.
And then, Chris Cillizza, we have that joint statement and the joint appearance with President Xi of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia. They sure didn't seem like they needed the U.S.
Seems to put us on even footing, put the U.S. on even footing with the North Korea in terms of what each side needs to do.
I mean, how do you explain it, Chris?
Well, Donald Trump said that he would deal differently with the world than Barack Obama, and the implication was that Barack Obama sort of was too deferential, didn't play tough enough. Donald Trump is not yet 6 months, coming on 6 months into his administration, but yeah, the reality would suggest it's much more difficult. It's much easier to say it than to actually do it. I do think at some point the rubber has to meet the road in terms of the era of strategic patience is over. Okay, well, what does that mean? You had David Sanger from the New York Times on in your last hour, who in his piece in the New York Times outlines the fact that there are just not any good options here for how we deal with North Korea. How do we exert influence over Russia and China when they have very different geopolitical interests and goals than ours, and when they are still, frankly, testing out Donald Trump to see what they can get away with at some level, to see sort of how he is going to deal with them. And so I think these trips do matter in that regard. And to Gordon's point, to start the trip off with a series of tweets is, yes, very Trumpian, but in some ways is the problem. If you had to isolate Donald Trump's biggest problem in his first 5.5 months in office, it's Donald Trump. It's his willingness to sort of go undermine, go against his administration's attempts, both domestically and in terms of foreign policy, to keep a consistent message, to say this is what the strategy will be. This is the tactics, these are the strategy. He just continues to sort of undermine that at every turn.
All right, so let's help the people out at home a little bit here, Gordon, because let's upset the premise. The premise is these tweets, the flippancy that the president likes to employ, it's a problem overseas. We've heard that here at home. People don't really buy it. They're like, this is who Trump is. He's strong, he's brash, he's disruptive.
It's good to be unpredictable.
He's a big talker, he's unpredictable, it shows muscularity, it makes people sit up and take notice, and depending on your partisan stripe, you'll feel one way or the other about it at home. Is it any different on the international scale, and if so, why?
Well, in Seoul, where I just was, there is deep concern about Trump's reliability. You know, the South Korean policy establishment has always taken the U.S. as a constant. And right now, they're very concerned about where U.S. policy is going. Now, I think that right now we're in a position where every solution going forward is going to be ugly. And so there are no-cost solutions. But at the same time, though, Trump, I think, needs to be much clearer in laying out the roadmap, not only to the Chinese and the Russians, but also to our friends and allies in the region. Because if there's a solution, that solution also runs through Seoul and Tokyo. And we got to remember that our friends have got to be with us, or we have no chance of crafting any sort of way forward.
And Gordon, I mean, you are so steeped in this. You've studied North Korea. You've written a book about North Korea. What did you think when you heard that they had launched, when it was confirmed that it was an intercontinental ballistic missile?
Well, this changes everything for a number of reasons. You know, first of all, they now can strike the U.S. homeland. They were testing heat shielding with this very high arc. But also, you know, this missile launched yesterday came from a Chinese launcher. It was a mobile truck, a transporter erector launcher. We need to start asking Beijing some very pointed questions, not only in private but also in public, about how come all of this Chinese equipment and Chinese missiles are showing up in North Korea's inventory. Because if we don't start asking Beijing those questions, we're never going to get to where we want to be with Beijing, because we're just, at this point, so far apart in our perceptions of what the Chinese want and what we want them to do.
Thank you for all the expertise. Panel, thank you very much.